Okay, well, thank you for attending our annual PRI's annual Sacramento conference. I found it fascinating so far. I'm Steven Greenhut. I'm the director of PRI's Free Cities Center. We explore market-based and good government ideas designed to improve cities. We don't just bash on all the bad city ideas, although we all know there are plenty of them, especially in some cities near us, but we're trying to find good ideas that actually improve cities, and that's the goal. I'm hoping you check out our website every day. We publish original articles, podcasts, videos, series of books. It's pacificresearch.org /free-cities, or you can just go to the PRI website and you'll be able to link to our free cities. So we also publish a series of booklets about different urban topics. The 7th installment, and the subject of this panel, is called "Is There a War on Suburbia? Calling a Truce in the Battle Over Land Use." So you've all got a copy of this, and it is still a proof copy, so you might find a typo, but don't hold it against us. The final ones will be out soon. So we have assembled a great panel of experts today to delve into some of these issues, and they really are pretty dominant in the legislature around the state. They're land use issues, and land use issues energize people because it's about where we live and how we get around. So so our land use battles here are heated as always with YIMBYs, the yes in my backyard types, and the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard types. They're often at odds. The latter say the former are waging a war on suburbia, hence the idea for the booklet. And the former say they're only trying to allow more types of development. In the booklet, I kind of go into some of the areas where I think each side is right and each side is wrong. At the Free City Center, we advocate a market-based approach, which means we side with loosening development rules for multifamily housing, but we also encourage more single-family construction, and we have nothing against the suburbs. Our goal isn't density per se, but freedom of choice, which sometimes means density. And sorting through these issues, when I look at some of the legislation and in my writing, people have a hard time focusing on that principled approach because we all get very concerned about what's happening in our neighborhood or what we think should happen in our town. So the whole debate involves complex issues about public spaces, transportation systems, and subsidies. And I believe there are many potential areas of agreement, especially regarding zoning and regulatory reform. And hence a question mark, is there a war on suburbia? I'm not arguing that there necessarily is. Now, I'm a fan of cities, suburbs, towns, and rural areas. They all have their charms, offer choices, and are a crucial part of the nation's cultural fabric. I've lived in all types of these areas. And why do I have to choose sides, right? Instead, we should reduce regulations, loosen the iron grip of zoning, allow private developers to meet various consumer niches that make all places better. That's our argument at the Free City Center. There certainly is a middle ground, provided policymakers and ideologues stop trying to dictate the best living arrangements for everyone. Okay, on to our esteemed panel. I'll introduce them, and then each panelist will provide a short presentation, and then we'll move on to questions. So Joffe Hernandez is a partner at Holland & Knight, which has offices in San Francisco and Los Angeles. She's practiced land use and environmental law for more than 30 years and leads the firm's West Coast Land Use and Environmental Group. She's one of California's top land use and environmental attorneys, and I believe is the expert on CEQA. Matthew Lewis is Director of Communications for California YIMBY. He also co-leads the Risky Business Project, an effort to quantify and communicate the economic risks of climate change in the U.S. Matthew is a YIMBY homeowner who believes there's plenty of room on his block for more neighbors. In fact, we have a video we did in Berkeley, and that is indeed his belief. Perfect. I don't think he rode his bicycle to the conference, although he might have taken transit.
I did.
Okay. Anyway.
With the train, right?
With the train, okay.
Oh, with the train.
And then Marc Joffe.
It tastes great together.
We argue about bicycles sometimes. Marc Joffe is a former policy analyst with Cato Institute and Reason Foundation and is one of California's top free market thinkers on housing and transportation policy. He's president of the Contra Costa Taxpayers Association and a California Policy Center visiting fellow. So, okay, let's start with Joffe.
So I was strongly encouraged to stand at the podium, and I almost never do what I'm strongly encouraged to do. And so...
it's a libertarian conference.
There you go. And a kid who grew up barely in Catholic schools, just edging against that expulsion line. So I am very glad to be here. It's always, frankly, good to not be in whatever silos we all live in. In my case, I've spent now 40 years, God forbid, in a legal practice that has centered around environmental law and then also land use, which is kind of a blood sport in California. I would like to understand from you how many of you are currently tracking in any way any kind of upzoning or housing element updates happening in your own towns. And for those of you who responded, how involved were you the last round 8 years ago? Yes, anybody? No, because, Matthew, a couple, because the California legislature has periodically, they wake up and they say, oh my God, there's gambling in Casablanca. In 1982, they declared there was a housing crisis, 1982. Young families couldn't afford to buy a home. It was a terrible situation, 1982, and then nothing happened. And we had a couple more rounds of that, and in 2017, the California legislature declared we have a housing crisis. It's actually kind of never abated, but enacted more than 200 laws intended to ameliorate the crisis, both by causing the production of more housing and by putting various bumpers around rental housing and occupants of housing. We have some considerable progress, if you think of progress as providing housing for people who can't afford it, and I do. I don't think it's okay for more than half of our young people to spend more than half of their income on rent. I think that's a broken society. I also don't think that you should have to work, and in this state now, 2-income full-time workers, and never have a shot at owning a home. I think that's a broken society. And so I am generally pro-housing. But in the political realm, just as we learned in the phonics wars, things take a crazy turn. And we have forces, environmentalists and climate advocates, organized labor, and kind of local government seeking to control its own destiny in a world where revenues to local government keep shrinking. Sales tax with e-commerce, various property tax restrictions, elimination of tax increment finance. Local government doesn't have enough money to do what it needs to do, and housing costs more, as has long been believed at least, than it pays for by way of increased city services, schools and parks and libraries and whatnot. And so local government versus labor versus environmentalists, who lost the political battle? Local government. And so state housing production laws have had a top-down pattern of demanding each city and county assume a far greater percentage and number of new housing units than has ever been done before, and also created enforcement teeth that are real for cities or counties that fail to follow through and then plan for and approve the required number of new houses. This has been an incredibly profitable period in my law firm practice because everybody has gone to the mattresses, as Mr. Soprano would have said. And in a way, and this is one of 3 messages I want to convey, it's all just a kabuki play, because we have to spend so much money to build anything,
Right.
that we ultimately end up with all these fabulous legal wins. I got your approvals for homes that will never be built. And when I speak of homes, I speak of all forms of homes. For example, we live in Berkeley and split our time with LA, where Matt also lives. And there was this triumphant outcome when a tower was approved in a parking lot in the BART station that's surrounded by single family and duplex housing in North Berkeley. It could be what, 20 stories or something crazy at the end of the day, with like 40% affordable and all union wages. And I was watching this and I'm like, okay, I'm too old to get involved in a neighborhood fight, and many of these are neighborhood fights. And I learned that the pro forma required to actually make that project pencil for the 2-bedroom units was $8,800 a month in rent. If you have $8,800, do you want to live in a BART parking lot? Of course the project doesn't pencil. Almost none of these projects actually pencil, the big parking lot projects. Build parking or the big apartment projects. Newport Beach, Palo Alto, oh yeah. Because the premium of being able to live that close in a high income area, think Manhattan, makes people be able to afford and be willing to afford rent. But we're not making home ownership products. Second point, home ownership is how Americans build multifamily wealth. I don't know how many of you had a parent who owned their home. I did. I don't know how many of you had a grandparent who owned their home. I did. My Mexican grandparents immigrated from Mexico as kids, but they eventually were able to buy a home. Those homes sustained both grandmothers who had long widowhoods and my parents when my dad was laid off permanently from U.S. Steel in Pittsburgh, California at age 56. Not a good time to permanently lose a good union job. Our absence of respect for home ownership to be attainable for working people is, for me, the civil rights crisis, horror of my career, matched only by the worst of these regulations, which says, and if you build a home where land is cheaper and you'll have to drive longer distances because you can't afford that, then you also need, in the price of your home, to pay extra because you're going to drive more. Who do you think that affects? People who can't afford to live where? And people who need to show up at a job on time to be paid. And it's not just a one-time hit. That higher home price, that's a higher mortgage price, that's a higher tax price, that's a higher insurance price. And it is inflicted on people by my party, the Democrats, in the name of climate change. And that is BS. So, my last message, because I am poor at taking direction, is to stray far out of my lane and say, donors who contribute to green groups thinking they are helping either the planet or the people need a different message, need some facts. And if you have access to such donors, because if you're here, you're probably not among them, although you may be, please, please reject the same dogma you've been hearing for years from my party. Please get some facts, because you aren't helping the economy, and I'll conclude by saying, or the environment, I'll conclude by saying every family that moves to Texas because they can't afford to stay in California triples its greenhouse gas emissions. So yo climate. Yo climate.
Wow,
please.
That's a great factoid.
And I'll stop there.
All right.
So Steve, thanks for having us. It's always fun to hear Jennifer give your perspective on things. And I think one of the things you'll find, Jennifer and I have actually overlapped professionally for many years. There's probably like 20% of things that if we weren't in front of you, we would be outside arguing about. And then the other 80% where we pretty much agree. So I work for California YIMBY. YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard. Our mission is to make California a place that's affordable to live, work, and raise a family. And we do that by focusing on housing policy in Sacramento here with the legislature, basically to do something that I'm hoping everyone is going to raise their hand and say they agree with. Giving people their property rights back. How do people feel about property rights? They're good, right?
Yay, property rights.
Yes, they're good. I'm in favor. The primary reason for the housing shortage in California is that we've actually taken away most people's property rights. And specifically, we've made it the most difficult in urban areas. And this is a well-documented history in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There's a very compelling chart from the city of Los Angeles, which is now potentially in free fall collapse. In 1960, the city of Los Angeles had the zoned capacity. I hate the word zoning because it's so wonky, but it means how many homes can you build in an area on an existing amount of property. Their zoned capacity was for 10 million people, and that was just in the city of Los Angeles. But the people of Los Angeles decided that they didn't like the property owners in Los Angeles to be allowed to build that many homes. So they changed the zoning and reduced it to 4 million. They literally by more than half the number of homes that property owners in Los Angeles would be allowed to build. Guess what that did over the next 10 years? The price of housing skyrocketed throughout Los Angeles. They literally did the equivalent of a price cap. Sorry, not a price cap, but a cap on the rights, right? They said you used to be able to build 2 or 3 homes per property, 4 homes, 6 homes per property. Now you can only build 1. So they took away all of those rights. Now this is long forgotten because it was so long ago. But the problem is that those rules are still in place. And if you want to know why Los Angeles has the highest number of homeless people in the developed world, why it has the highest rate of housing overcrowding in the developed world, it's because the city leaders back in the 70s decided they did not want property owners to have the right to build more homes on property that they owned. I use that as an example because that really kind of sums up the primary mission of California YIMBY. Now, something that Jennifer mentioned was this RHNA process, and oh my God, I feel bad for all of you who have engaged with it, just to be clear. Like it is not something that is joyful or fun. RHNA stands for the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, and it is something that is mandated by the state of California that all the various metropolitan areas go through every 7 years, and it's like, oh, you gotta tell us how many homes you're gonna build and divvy them up, and you do this and you do that, and there's a number that they're supposed to meet for each RHNA territory, okay? This is a completely made up number. It's the government just sort of pulling a number out of its you-know-what and saying, build this many homes. And the problem with that, for one, is that the government shouldn't be telling people how many homes to build. That's not the job of the government. The market can do that perfectly fine if you let it. But the other thing is that the number was always a low ball because it's a political number. So communities have been saying, oh, well, we met our RHNA target. And just to give you a sense of how absurd this is, about 5 years ago, before we'd updated some of these rules, Beverly Hills, people know where Beverly Hills is, right? It's not just the hills, it's actually the whole city down in the flats of LA, right? They had a target of a certain amount of affordable housing for the whole city of Beverly Hills. How many people think that number was over 1,000? Whole city of Beverly Hills. How many people think that number was over 100? Over 100, a couple hands. How many people think that number was over 10? It was 2. It was 2.
Wow.
For the entire city of Beverly Hills, because the process was a joke. It was a political exercise. It had nothing to do with providing housing for people. It was a box-checking exercise for a bunch of bureaucrats. And if we know something that the housing bureaucrats are good at, it's checking boxes. Okay? So we engage in that process and try to make the numbers stricter and strengthen the process because it's the process we have. But let me be really clear. California YIMBY would be much, much happier if we had a clean return of property rights to the residents of California so that they could build the homes that we so desperately need on property that they already own. And this is really our mission in Sacramento is to make it legal to build homes. I know Steven set this up as, is there a war on the suburbs? And I had to kind of laugh, mostly because most of the housing that's been built in the state in the last 40 years has been suburban. If anything, there's a war on the cities, but it's actually not even being waged by the suburbs. It's being waged by the, incompetent people leading our cities. So something that we really need to work on, and Jennifer and I were actually celebrating privately here, is we need better city leadership. And we just, thankfully, kind of achieved some of that in Berkeley. But there's a relationship between improving governance in cities and the housing outcomes. And the reason, for those of you who don't know, but housing decisions are almost entirely made by cities, not just in California, but in the United States. This is not something the states usually get involved with at all. It's really just because we've got a crisis that's so incredibly bad that the state has actually gotten involved. And it's using these outdated frameworks, such as the RENA process from the 1980s, that seemed like a good idea at the time, but now just don't really work the way they need to. And so we've got to update all these processes. There's much bigger fights ahead to reform land use in California. And I want to say a word about what is happening in Los Angeles, because this is something that's going to, for those of you who aren't aware, I hope you're holding on to your pocketbooks. You're going to be paying for the Los Angeles fires. This was approved last week. This money is coming from you. I'm a homeowner in Berkeley. I'm going to be paying. What's happening in insurance markets right now, I wake up every day and I'm in a bunch of different groups with some experts trying to figure out how to prevent a total meltdown. This is the biggest crisis, not just in the state of California, but that the United States has ever faced. Stephen, I know you mentioned earlier that I'm involved with the Risky Business Project. That was actually 10 years ago.
Oh,
it's okay though.
It's still on your bio.
It's very relevant. It's very relevant. This
Yeah.
was it was a risk assessment, and just to give a sense, it was of climate risk, but it was led by Hank Paulson, Robert Rubin, Mike Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, not a bunch of lightweights. These are guys who are serious about finance, former Treasury secretaries, people who really care about interest rates and the solvency of the American economy. And one of the things that we found was where most homes are being built today in the fastest growing states, including in California, is in the highest risk fire areas, the highest risk flood areas, and the highest risk hurricane areas. And it's gotten so bad that about 10 years ago, FEMA, the Federal Flood Insurance Program, actually hit the equivalent of bankruptcy. They ran out of money. And they had been going back to Congress over and over again saying, just give us more money. And what was that money doing? It was, the FEMA was taking it, it was giving it to homeowners who had lost their homes in a flood, and what were they doing? They were rebuilding the same home in the same place, and it was flooding again and getting knocked down, and then they do it again, and then they do it again, and then they do it again. The total value of property at risk in the state of California from fire is $3 trillion. The federal government doesn't have that kind of money. Nobody has that kind of money. We cannot afford to bail out all these properties. FEMA has already gone bankrupt. Last Friday, the FAIR Plan, the insurer of last resort, announced it was out of money. And so now they're going to come to all of us and say, we're going to ask each of you for $60, just one time. Yeah, just one time. Make a note of that. They're saying just this once, right? No, it's not going to be just this once. The scale of the liability from climate risk in the state of California would blow your mind. Nobody has the kind of money to solve it. And addressing land use is crucial. And the reason I wanted to bridge these topics is that the location of all of this housing in fire zones, there's been abundant research on this. A lot of it is because it is in fact cheaper to build there, but a lot of it is because there's nowhere else for people to build. The prime land in urban areas, it is illegal. 75% of the land in Los Angeles, it is illegal to build any more housing. That's the same in most of San Francisco, in most of San Jose, in most of Berkeley, in most of Sacramento. Not Sacramento's a little better actually in many cases. But the point is, we have to give property owners back their rights. We have to give people the ability to build what they want to build. The market can, in fact, solve this problem. And in fact, the scale of the finance needed is so massive, only the market can solve it. One of the biggest challenges we face in the YIMBY movement, frankly, is opponents from our far left. And that's why I feel like there should be some allies in this room, because we really struggle with this. Opponents from the far left who will say with a fully straight face, we should not allow the market to solve the housing crisis. The government should solve the housing crisis by building public and social housing and taxing people to pay for it. And I wish I were joking. I wish I were joking. It is so absurd to consider that a housing market with trillions of dollars of value and trillions of dollars of need will be solved by public subsidy. It's like these people don't have the first bit of math in their blood. And they think that the government can solve this problem. So we really need more allies for property rights in the YIMBY movement. I know there's a lot of stuff. I was listening to Mr. Rasmussen speak earlier, and I was kind of like, okay, I know some of that's, maybe I would debate some of that, and there's some stuff we don't agree on. But I'm hoping that what we do agree on is that property rights are sacrosanct in this country, and that the biggest challenge we have in housing right now is that we're impeding them at a level that would blow your mind. And we're letting cities do that. And with cities like Los Angeles on the cusp of collapse, we no longer have the option of sort of debating if this is a problem. If Los Angeles goes under, that is a significantly negative impact on the entire state of California. If the insurance market collapses in this state, which it is now on the cusp of doing, that will affect all of you. All of you, whether you have a mortgage or not. That money is going to come out of your pocket. And so we have an urgent need to solve this problem across the state, and I hope you'll join us and help. Thanks.
And I do have to say,
Yes, I figured I'd be more compliant. Before I get into some prepared remarks, I just wanted to provide some context that might be interesting to some of you. So I've been traveling within the fiscally conservative movements within California for a long time. The last thing I worked on last year was opposing a $20 billion affordable housing bond for the 9 counties of the Bay Area. I'm sure you were opposed to that as well, given what you just said. Most of the people that I've met in that work, both in Los Angeles and in the San Francisco Bay Area, are petrified of losing single-family zoning. They might live in the Sunset neighborhood or the Richmond neighborhood in the outskirts of San Francisco. They like what they have, and they don't want to see it change. I think that one thing that the Democratic YIMBY folks have done that has been a huge mistake is try to scare them. So one of the things that we saw over the last couple of years was a proposal in the Outer Sunset for 50-story skyscraper right in the middle of the community. That's not how you're going to build support for more dense housing. I just got back from visiting my wife's neighborhood where she grew up in Lima, Peru. When she grew up, everybody in that street lived in a single family or duplex. Now, about half of those units have been replaced by small apartment buildings. Those people who owned their plots used their property rights, which apparently still exist in Peru, not unlike in California, to sell out and let a developer build. And I didn't see a lot of hostility or friction or whatever. It was a natural, it was an organic migration from the previous regime of single-family homes to greater density. And I think that's the way forward, not scaring people with, we're going to put a skyscraper next to your single-family home, we're going to put a gigantic homeless shelter next to your single-family home, which they talk about doing in Venice. So yes, although as a libertarian, in my ideal world, all zoning laws would die tomorrow, as a realist, I think you have to look at transitional approaches and gradually moving away from single-family homes in some neighborhoods towards duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and so forth. That seems to me more reasonable. Anyway, Steven asked me here because I'm really into transit, so I thought I would give like a bit of a transit flavor to this discussion. Some of you who don't live near major cities may not know that transit agencies have been transforming themselves into housing agencies as well, because they do such a great job of safely and reliably moving people around that they figured they would expand their mandate. So we have this concept called transit-oriented development, and you heard a reference to it during Jennifer's comments about the BART parking lot in North Berkeley. Transit-oriented development is defined as the creation of compact, walkable, pedestrian-oriented mixed-use communities centered around high-quality train systems. This makes it possible to live a lower-stress life without complete dependence on a car for mobility and survival. So it sounds good, and BART is all in on this. So far, they've completed 4,200 units of transit-oriented development, or TOD housing, and they have 4,000 more units in the pipeline. Another big transit agency in the Bay Area, the Valley Transportation Authority, has 28 sites under development in Santa Clara County. Now, what are some of the limitations of these units? Well, they're necessarily close to train stations, so there's noise from trains. They're usually close to freeways because BART, for example, was built around the freeway system, so you're going to be subject to noise and extra pollution from freeways. And then finally, they're small and they have relatively limited facilities for children. So they're not a great match for young families who want to, have 2 or 3 children, who want them to be able to play safely outside. Also, transit-oriented development is based on ideas that have become somewhat less relevant in the post-COVID era. So the idea was, you would live in Walnut Creek or North Berkeley in your transit-oriented development, and then you'd get on BART and you go to San Francisco to work. Well, a lot of people aren't doing that. San Francisco, most recently, I think, had about a 37% vacancy rate for offices. So a lot of people aren't going downtown, or at least they're not going downtown 5 days a week anymore. So it becomes a lot less important to live near, where you live within commute distance from where you work by train. The other thing I think is a concern, although I think the empirical evidence for it is mixed right now, is that TOD may be contributing to a glut of apartments versus single-family homes. Now, I know that in our neighborhood outside of the Walnut Creek BART station, condos are already going down relative to houses. I haven't seen systematic evidence across that of California. However, in the Bay Area, we do know that 18,000 Bay Area apartment units are currently featuring move-in specials where you'll get multiple weeks or even multiple months of free rent. So it suggests that potentially there's a glut of apartments because single-family homes are not offering those kind of move-in specials. I think also transit-oriented development can become a victim of what Ezra Klein has insightfully called everything bagel liberalism, where government tries to do so many different things at once with one policy that they do a bad job of accomplishing any of it. So if we look at Caltrain, another system in Northern California, their transit-oriented development policy includes discouraging car use by limiting on-site parking, achieving high standards of energy efficiency and environmental sensitivity, providing affordable housing, meaning subsidized housing for people who are not at the area median income, and then supporting unionized labor by offering prevailing wages and encouraging project labor agreements. So that's a lot to accomplish, and you're not going to do anything well when you're trying to accomplish so many things. The problem with the bond that was being proposed to the Bay Area was portables, manufactured housing were not going to be allowed. It all had to be union-built, on-site housing, using prevailing wages at costs approaching or even exceeding $1 million a unit. And that's not affordable housing. Maybe it's subsidized housing, maybe it's affordable to the individual who's going to move into it, but it's not affordable from the point of view of public policy. Just want to hit one other quick issue before we go into the general questions. The alternative to this high-density housing is more, quote-unquote, sprawl. And that's the way it's really worked successfully in Texas, right? You have the outer rings of places like Dallas being developed with subdivisions, and that's the way it used to work here and in many other parts of the country. But now we have urban growth boundaries that limit development and confine it into urban areas. So, big example of that is what's going on in Solano County right now. So many of you may have heard of a project called California Forever. So here's a project where a bunch of very affluent people pooled their money together and bought 60,000 acres of farmland in Solano County. And for those who don't know, that's between San Francisco and Sacramento. It's near Fairfield and Vacaville. So They then came up with a measure called the East Solano Plan that they wanted to put on the ballot. And they needed to do that because they needed a carve-out from an earlier ballot initiative called the Orderly Growth Initiative. This goes back into the early 1980s and was updated in the 2000s. And basically it forbids residential development in unincorporated areas. Most of Solano County is unincorporated. California Forever ran into a buzzsaw of opposition. Every issue was trotted out, including Representative Garamendi saying, hey, this is too close to the Air Force Base. This is a national security threat. But if you look at maps of other Air Force bases and other military bases, you'll see that there's often housing right up to the entrance of the base. So they just were trying to come up with whatever they could to stop these billionaires from building housing. Now, for those of us who prefer suburbs, California Forever might not be seen as ideal because it's mixed-use development, walkable communities, apartments, and small single-family homes on smaller lots mixed in with retail and offices. However, that may be something that people like. I live in a mixed-use community near BART. I'm more on the libertarian or conservative side. I don't mind being in a dense area, and I think maybe other people will look for various intermediaries. It might not be Levittown of 1950, and it may not be Manhattan, of whenever. It'll be somewhere. It could be potentially somewhere in between, where there's a mixture of traditional single-family housing, multiple dwelling units, and retail uses. So, as to return it to the original theme that Steven started us with, let the market decide. Let's have a variety of solutions and get the strong hand of government off of the scales of decision. Thanks.
Thank you, Marc. And I'd like all of the panelists to answer this. We'll just start with Jennifer, go in. The LA wildfires and talk about rebuilding and Marshall plans has resulted in talk about what the rebuilding should look at. Some urbanists are talking about forcing a higher density process. I want to get your thoughts, and I think that touches on where the two of you were disagreeing about where we should rebuild, and is it appropriate to build the way we have been building in the state? Jennifer.
Sure. So in the Berkeley Hills, it used to be called kind of the Fire Hills. Oh, sorry. Because there's two mics. The Berkeley Hills used to be called the Fire Hills because there were a whole bunch of people that my steelworker dad would call smart but not sensible, who would fiddle around with their own wiring. Plus, we didn't really know how much and how thick wires needed to be. So periodically a house would burn. And we don't have that anymore because we figured out how thick the wires needed to be, and we require them to be that thick. That is not rocket science. We know how to build fire-safe structures. Newer structures, even in total burn zones like Santa Rosa, like Altadena, totally innocuous, flat suburbs, not highfalutin fire zone. No, they're just a town. And we didn't build very well for fire in the 50s. We also had this kind of like, let's go up a cool canyon. Ooh, it was kind of like hippiness, Woodside, whatever. Not a great idea for fire. No. And if you go to Malibu, you'll see these big roads. And if you go to Pacific Palisades, which is part of LA, you see these tiny little roads, just like we do all over Northern California, because we hate roads. We hate them. So we don't make them wide enough to have fire trucks go in and people go out at the same time, and then people die. So the first thing to know is we know, and we have proven over and over, that newer communities, appropriately planned and managed to get rid of excess fuel, to have appropriate water for fire, and actually have enough access, these are safe communities. How do we know? Because they're the places firefighters go to rest. When Orange County was on fire, when San Diego was on fire, where did they go? To rest. Where did people in those locations go in evacuation? They went to what was designed today to meet standards that work. So I completely reject the idea that there are these massive areas all over California that are just unsafe and therefore can't be built. Nonsense. Doesn't mean every place is safe. But to the wildfire question in particular, every new structure that's built there is going to have to meet those new fire codes. Every new structure will be far safer. Do we have the fortitude to widen roads? Do we have the willingness to provide enough water pressure? Which, by the way, requires more water. And you know what more water does? It allows more people. And we hate more people. Marin County has had an iron grip around the throat of its population simply by denying new water. So are we going to allow safe water? Are we going to allow safe roads? Well, I think there's going to be a pretty big green idea of managed retreat, it's called. Let's just not build up there. Really, how much of California, I'll close with this, how much of California's 100 million acres, 100 million acres, how much of that percentage-wise do you think is built by a combination of infrastructure like roads and people, structures? Anybody think it's 30% of California built? Nope. 15%? 10%. It's 6. New Jersey's 35%. Florida's about 18. Somehow we can't have a 7% solution for the 40 million people who live here, who could live in safe edge communities, which then, by the way, create a fire break so that everybody living in a 1950s home is not going to be incinerated. We still haven't had a drought that is longer than the drought that happened at the beginning of the last century, where climate change was not a factor. There was this thing, the Dust Bowl you might have heard about. We have really radically different years of rainfall. We can plan for it. We know how to do it technically. The only thing in the way of rebuilding is the strong and litigious and absolutely dunderheaded opinions that collectively, in the hands of lawyers, result in absolutely nothing being built. The Banana Republic, build absolutely nothing near anyone. I hope LA is not entering an age of Banana Republic.
All right, Matt, I bet you have something to say.
I do have a whole positive rap. I just choose not to share it yet.
So I think that the most important thing to impress upon folks here is Jennifer's concerns about her profession, which I share, notwithstanding, and CEQA is the name that has not been mentioned just yet. We all have problems with the California Environmental Quality Act. We are so through the looking glass on insurance crisis, not climate crisis, insurance crisis, that the decisions on a lot of this stuff actually are already out of Democratic hands. And I think something that's very clear is that no one in Sacramento in the building fully understands that yet. That the insurance industry is coming down on its side, and its side is they need to run profitable business. In 1988, the voters of California, thanks to Ralph Nader, not my favorite guy, decided that it didn't want the insurance industry to have a pathway to a profitable business in California. And they passed Prop 103. What Prop 103 did, how many people, I'm just going to take a guess, how many people like price controls? I don't see any hands going up. In the state of California, the insurance industry has been subject to price controls since 1988. What that means is that the Californians who live here actually don't know how much risk they're taking on when they buy a house. It is not reflected in the price. It is illegal in the state of California for insurance premiums to reflect risk. It's against the law. So any concern we have about where you're going to be able to build this or that, it's completely out of our hands now because the losses have been so massive. The LA fire is going to be a $250 billion loss. $250 billion lost in those fires. The state of California's budget is $250 billion. Nobody has this kind of money. So I think that there's, we got to get right with what's actually happening with where we've built. I want to disagree with something that Jennifer said and then agree. So you mentioned that the Berkeley Hills have been made safer. The largest concentration of FAIR Plan participants in Northern California are in the Berkeley Hills. What that means is that their insurers have decided they are not safer. Now, is the insurance industry right or wrong? It doesn't matter. Because if they want to cancel you, they can. They can walk away and then you're on the FAIR Plan. And what the insurance industry has decided is that the Berkeley Hills are not safe enough for them. So if it's not safe enough for them, I don't know who is supposed to come and decide that they're safe. As a secondary thing, the state of California has already proven that it's not going to be able to foot the bill. Like, what do you think the value is of the housing in the Berkeley Hills? It's got to be 50, 60, 70 billion dollars. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money.
But the fires aren't from thin wires.
I agree, but it almost doesn't matter because the point is the buildings themselves are now uninsurable on the market. You've got to go on the FAIR Plan for all those houses. But the second thing I want to say is there is this question of road widening, and it's actually a really important question because the way California does this is something that should be offensive to everyone who believes in property rights. They condemn your land. When Caltrans wants to widen a road, they go and what do? They take a bunch of people's houses and they knock them down, and that's how they widen the road. And in neighborhoods with very narrow streets, where are they going to do this? They're going to knock down a bunch of houses and make the road wider. I don't see that as a solution to fire safety for the people whose homes get taken or their land gets taken for the wider roads. The problem was that we built these neighborhoods with houses on steep canyons with very narrow roads that were inaccessible in the first place. It is a very hard problem to correct. What I would posit is that the approach is to harden all the existing properties as best you can. There's tons of lessons coming out of the LA fires right now. I mean, this fire had behavior that nobody had ever seen before. And I'm in a bunch of threads. There's a group called Megafire Action. I would encourage you all to check them out. They're laser focused on trying to make communities more resilient to wildfire like this. One of the things that they found was that there was a number of newer properties built to Class A standards that burned. The reason had nothing to do with the building itself, but because of the heat of the older buildings around them, that the heat generated was so high that it melted the materials. They were beyond the melting point of the newer materials. And what they're looking at is the need for a community level approach to safety. We're going to be hearing a lot about this. In fact, this is all we're going to be talking about in fire safety pretty much for the rest of our lives, because you can't just go building by building and achieve fire safety. If your house is completely fireproof and all the homes around you burn, there is a good chance your house will burn too. And if it doesn't, are you going to go back to a community that looks like a charred Mars landscape while you're waiting for 7 years to get permission from the state of California to rebuild?
Now, Matt?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to, no, it's all great. And you touched on one of my favorite subjects, eminent domain, but that's another, maybe next year's panel.
Okay.
And I just quickly mentioned the Donner Tahoe subdivision, which has been fabulous on being on fire-wise. I'm going to gyp you, Marc, maybe because I've known you the longest, but mostly because I want to get a couple questions from the audience before we got to wrap up. So do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, we've got one right over here. Here, let's get the microphone.
Talk about the libertarian aspect. I want to build a house where I want in Canyon. And then when it burns down, we come to the government and say, I want some liberal policies to build my house back. And so we got to deal with that. If people want to make choices, they make choices, they have consequences. But there's a couple things that say affordable housing. That's an oxymoron. Housing costs what it costs. It's simply take from you, give it to him. It's a Robin Hood affair. Never really pans out quite like you would like it. But the main point I have is if the state, the county, the local, the municipal has a contract with you, you buy a single family home, you have a contract, there's use, all of that, and there's 500 homes, therefore there's this big park. You have 500 homes, therefore there's an elementary school, and you have so many homes, you have entrance, exit, and it's all planned. Now you say you come on every single one of those lots and build a second or third unit. No parking, no, as you say, wider roads. And people, and I call it ruining one neighborhood at a time. And you have investors coming, a lot of foreign investors, and of course BlackRock and others. They'll buy a 5-bedroom house, make 6 or 7 bedrooms, concrete the front of the house, and have all these parking. And you ask, why are people moving to Texas?
Well, let's, how about I start Mark for
Yeah.
the answer?
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, we have to be a little careful. So a community, a town or city is not a homeowners association. With a homeowners association, you can restrict things. We have to allow land uses to evolve. If we make everything.
Please let him.
If-
Yeah.
Right.
I have a contract, that contract should be kept, that was my point.
Well, you don't really
You don't
have.
have a contract.
You don't really have a contract, okay?
No,
If
with
you
the-
were
You
in-
don't. It's not-
If you
there's
were
no
in
legal-
an,
there's
if
no
you
legal
were in
contract.
a homeowners association, yes, you would have a contract. If you're in a city, you have the presumption that maybe the zoning will not be changed. But again, if you have the zoning being the same for 100 years or 200 years, I can guarantee you that community is going to deteriorate because things change, land uses change, people's preferences change. If a community can't keep up with that, it's not going to flourish.
I have actually a libertarian answer for that question. If you want to tell me what to do on my property, you're free to buy it. If you don't want to buy it, then I'm going to do what I want on my property. How about that? Because when I purchased my home, I actually read the full deed. And in the deed, it actually talks about stuff like subject to the zoning and the regulations of the city of Berkeley, which is a democracy. And if the people of Berkeley want to change the zoning and the regulations, we're free to do that. And in fact, one of the things Jennifer and I were talking about before we got started was we've actually had a very successful pro-housing movement in the city of Berkeley that got rid of the sort of more crazy socialists, anti-housing people on the council and are now more pro-property rights. And they're about to pass the ability for people like me to build 4 homes on my property. And I'm thrilled by the fact that I'm gaining my property rights back. And the fact is, I'm not required to, and neither is any one of my neighbors. And I think that's something that's really important to sort of ground this conversation in. We're talking about property owners regaining the right to do what they want with property that they own and is protected by the United States Constitution. We're talking about a return to a first principle about property rights here. That is the fundamental question on the table, okay? So when you talk about, oh, well, but there's this contrast, like, well, look, yes, homeowners associations are in fact the mechanism that people came up with to avoid outside influence on the land use contract. And I encourage everybody who wants that, that's a great pathway for you. For the rest of us, we have democracy and property rights.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up here. I think we're at the end. Unless you have a really quick comment.
Super quick. You know how like innocuous grasshoppers turn into locusts when there's too many of them? California's, I think, overly emphatic focus on increasing density in existing community is making us like locusts. We can purpose build safe new communities. If only we hadn't set up about 900,000 laws and regs that say never shall one touch
You can.
that freeway exit field. The fact is, we know how to build new. New actually is not just safe, it's home ownership opportunities, it's new communities, it's families. And instead of trying to cram everyone into a 5-bedroom home that gets chopped up, fine, I guess, if that's where you want to be and that's where you want to go and you can afford that. I'm kind of an all of the above housing person. But we can't anywhere in the world have enough housing at an affordable price in a system that puts a containment zone around what's already built and say only there can new things go. And I'm hoping that's a point of solution. There's the whole kind of bipartisan group emerging, frankly younger than me, because this is all my fault, my generation's fault, Nader's fault, called the Abundance Network, which is like,
thank you, yes.
Get out of the way, you boomers. You have what you need. We need a place to live too, and let us live in a new community
Okay.
like Solano.
Jennifer brought something up that we really wanted to mention. Both she and I are involved. There is a burgeoning movement across the country. It's coming out of San Francisco, LA, New York, all over the place, called the Abundance Movement. And it is a more moderate politics that is focused on simply problem solving, on fixing cities, on dealing with the far left problems we have in our governance, which are significant in many US cities, and really trying to return to a more fundamental grounding of property rights. So check it out, it's the Abundance Network. You'll be hearing more about them, and it is a very nonpartisan, focus on solving problems.
Thank you, panelists. This is an exciting topic, so check out Free Cities Center where we get into these issues.
Always fun.
And
Yeah,
Tim?
for sure. Thanks.